"4,400 years ago, this object was carved. It was not carved from stone, not casted with copper, but carved from wood. And the dating itself makes it way older than Christianity, older than the Viking Age, and also older than the idea of sovereign nations itself. And when examining this particular artifact, it's very clear that it was made with intention. And a question that I ask myself when looking at this artifact is that, what did this mean? What did the ancient people see in the world that we don't recognize anymore? And I think that most people who are presented with this artifact today look at it just like that, and another curiosity or an artifact from a time where people were full of superstition. But I have a notion that this was way more important to them than that. That this was something alive and sacred to them. And if we start off with the discovery itself, this serpent was found in Finland. And it was preserved for millennia in wetland soil. And what makes this a bit different is that the wetland soils at this particular place is very, very low in oxygen. And an environment like that is very good for preserving organic materials such as wood. And it's extremely rare when talking about archaeology that wood survives for this long. So it truly is a very special find, so to speak. And what caught the attention of the archaeologists was that it got very clear to them fast that this was not a random piece of driftwood, so to speak, because it was very deliberately carved. It had a slithering serpent shape that was clear, but more than anything, the head itself was very intricately carved. So the shape of the head was very clear that it was a serpent. So the theories that are going around this object is that it has some kind of ritualistic connection. And they think that this particular object was held or carried, or even a staff, but later on got deposited as some kind of offering. And I think the notion that it was found in a wetland is quite important here, because if we look at wetlands in ancient Europe, these were very, very important places. Not only the wetlands, but if you look at creeks and streams, lakes, and certain parts of the Metzen, the forest, they were very important to our ancestors, because these places were seen as liminal places where that were boundary zones to the world, so to speak. So by offering to the wetlands or the bogs or the creek, you gain some kind of access to the other realms, so to speak. And in archaeology, they oftentimes find these types of offerings in bogs and lakes and rivers. And the usual things you tend to find is things like weapons, jewelry, animal sacrifices, and even sometimes humans. So human sacrifices, it might be, but it can also be a sacrifice of free will. And the core idea of all of this is that the world wasn't seen as dead matter. It was seen as something very much alive, which I've talked about before. And if we look at the serpent for a second, the serpent comes back throughout different cultures, and it has very strong symbolisms to transformation of life, rebirth, hidden knowledge, secret knowledge, and the death and renewal. And it has a connection to the underworld, but also the water. And I think there's a very good explanation for the snake having this particular connection into these things. Because if we look at the snake, it sheds its skin. So in a sense, it gets reborn after shedding its skin. But it also travels between realms, so to speak. It can access places men cannot go. And it can go in the ground, in the water, under the roots, and under stones. So I think this is the reason why the serpent has such a strong position in northern symbolism. And the serpent as a deity oftentimes moves around the edges of reality, if that makes sense, or beneath things and around things. And it has a symbolism of being the boundary to the dark, the evil, the unknown, so to speak. I think you all have read stories when you have to pass snakes in order to continue the hero's journey and things of that nature. It's all the same symbolism, ancient symbolism. And we cannot, of course, mention snakes without mentioning Jörmungandr, the world serpent. And the world serpent famously encircles the realm of the living in Norse mythology. And it's you could say a cosmic boundary being. It connects itself by biting down on its own tail, and thereby controls the sea, the chaos, and the fate of the human of the humans, basically. And I'm not saying that this particular artifact found in Finland is directly connected to Jörmungandr, just to be clear. I'm just thinking that there's a larger story arc to be found here, and it's not a coincidence that these patterns repeat over different types of culture. And I think it's important to say that the serpent keeps returning throughout different stages of human, air quote, evolution, and across centuries and across all northern cultures, basically. And I think there's a very interesting idea here that myths may grow from older symbolic memory. I've talked about this before, and that the symbolisms actually survive way longer than civilizations do throughout time. As so this whole imagery of the serpent is very, 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 very old, and it keeps coming back. And in Finnish culture, there's the tradition of synty. And synty is a type of origin songs that explains the origin of many different things. For example, you have the synty of the origin of iron, and the synty of the origin of fire, the synty of the origin of disease. But you also have the synty of the origin of the snake, or the Käärmeen, as it's named in Finnish. And I think it's an important mindset to understand, because by knowing something's origin, you also understand its nature of being, if you will. And knowledge back then was relational, because if you didn't know something, you couldn't relate to it either. So I think it's if we look at the serpent in Finnish folklore, it's not just an animal, you know, just like the karhu, the bear in Finnish mythology. It's a symbolic force, you could say. It's what you get when you combine fear with respect. And it was also believed that the serpent was connected to hidden powers of the realms, so to speak. Outside the Finnish folklore itself, you can also find reference in this particular book, Mythologia Fennica, which is a very hard to come by book, but it gives you some references here. That the book in itself, it's a collection of folklore and beliefs from a very, very long time ago, and they show you the echoes of a way older worldview, so to speak. And there are still fragments from this world that are very much alive in today's Finland. For example, there are a lot of themes that the forest had a presence, the Metsenväki, which I've talked about, and waters had force, animals were symbolic, like I said. The snake represents fear and respect, but also connects to the ancient wisdoms, and that nature is not an empty place. It's a place that is very much alive and connects the dead with the living, so to speak. But I think what's important to note here is that we're not talking about organized religion here at all. We're talking about a relationship to nature, and it's a way more animistic way of thinking of the world than we are used to in, for example, Abrahamic beliefs, where man is put on top of nature to dominate it. Meanwhile, paganism and animism places man in the mix of nature, being a part of nature, which is a vastly different thing, I would say. And I think that the modern mindset today, we look at things as objects in a more broadly speaking way, just like the example I did in the beginning of the video. If someone sees this artifact, we see it just like another object, and we look at nature as a resource, and which is controlled by different mechanisms. And the older mindset of Northern Europe was that it was more about the relationships between people and the relationship to nature and the presence and the forces. And it was not like we see in the Marvel franchises today, that the gods were everywhere, and it was more subtle. It was just a part of everyday living, I would say. And I mentioned this some weeks ago, that we still have this very animistic modern echoes, if you will. We still knock on wood. We still talk to our cars, and we still have this intrinsic feeling of that we need to stay quiet in the forests when visiting the Metzenbäcki, for example. And we still have this feeling that certain places feel heavy without any explanation. It's in the walls, you know, that whole thing. And some places, they have a certain atmosphere or even presence. Perhaps an old wetland, who knows? But I think that these instincts, they haven't really disappeared. We have just become very good at ignoring them. But the world gave us extraordinary powers, relatively speaking. It has given us science, and it given us medicine and technology that makes all of this here even possible. But in a sense, it also flattened our sense of reality. Our forests quickly became resources for us to use, and the rivers became an infrastructure for us to use for trade and whatnot. And animals kind of became units for us to count and use. And today's humanity is centric around things that are measurable, and that everything can be categorized and explained and rationalized. But then still, why does objects like these affect us so much? Why? Because I think that beneath all of this, you know, the science exteriors and the technology and all those wonderful things, don't get me wrong here, we see something that is ancient, and not necessarily magical in that sense, but something that kind of reminds us that there was a time when we were a part of all of this. There was a time when the human experience was deeply connected to the natural world. And the older worlds, they were more... They approached the world with, I think it's called reverence rather than domination, which is I would argue anyways, the more modern take on approaching the world. And I think that perhaps this little carved serpent survived in our imaginations for thousands of years, and even long time after the hand that carved it disappeared, because it represents more than an animal, I think. It represents the very relationship between man and nature. And this wooden sculpture remained in the wetlands of Finland for over 4,000 years. Not because it was a practical thing, and not because it was an efficient thing either, like the modern times, but because it actually meant something to the people who carved this serpent. And perhaps the strangest thing to all of this is that even now we kinda intrinsically understand what it is, I would argue. Let me know if you agree. Okay, folks. If you followed along for this long, I applaud you. Please consider leaving a comment or a like on the video, and also consider becoming a channel member if you feel like it. Okay, have a lovely day, and I talk to you later. As usual, Tyrdom out.